The curtain has fallen down on a decades-long career in politics. Outgoing US President Joe Biden has delivered his final speech, and he says the very soul of America is at stake. He's preparing, of course, to give way to Donald Trump, who makes a return and will be sworn in as President of the United States on Monday, the 20th of January, ushering in his second term in really what has been one of the most incredible political comebacks, not only in American history, I dare say anywhere in the world. So what does the future look like for the US? And importantly, how will that impact on the relationship with South Africa? I'm pleased to tell you my guest is Dr. Terence McNamee, who is a writer, consultant, and non-resident global fellow at the Wilson Center. Dr. Terence, it's great to have you on the show again. We spoke, of course, in the run-up to the elections in November. The spectacular comeback by Donald Trump is one that is going to be written about in the history books, no doubt. But let's look back on Joe Biden. A decades-long political career has come to an end.
Yeah, thanks, Bongani. Good to be with you. Now, assessing presidential legacies is important, but it's a complicated task, and it's usually best done many years, even decades later. But if we just focus on this historical moment, I mean, regardless of what one might think of Biden's legislative legacy at home or his policies abroad or the way he conducted himself personally in office, I think no one can escape the almost overwhelming feeling of defeat and failure that hangs over his final days. And I think there's one big reason for that, and it is this. Joe Biden came out of retirement and ran for the presidency at the age of 78 for one reason, and one reason alone. And that was to put an end to Donald Trump's time in the White House. So after Biden won in 2020, his most important vow was to unify the country and transition America away from the kind of politics and rhetoric that Trump represented. As an American colleague of mine described it yesterday, this is a tragic, ironic historical moment because not only did Biden fail to do that, but Donald Trump and what he represents is seemingly stronger than it has ever been in the United States. So if Americans of different incomes and classes and even races unified around anyone, it was around Trump. So Biden did not cast Trump into the dustbin of history, as it were. On the contrary, Trump has been normalized. So I think for that huge overarching fact, I think that this moment must feel like a deep personal failure for Biden and his closest advisors.
And of course, for Trump, it is an incredible victory. But also Biden warning about an oligarchy taking shape in America, individuals with extreme wealth and power and influence. And he says this presents a real threat to democracy.
Yeah, I think it does. And it's very interesting that you mentioned Eisenhower, because obviously his famous speech in 1961, Biden was channeling Eisenhower's very prescient description of the rise of the military-industrial complex. But this time, Biden is warning about the concentration of power in what he calls the tech-industrial complex. And I woke up this morning to the news that Musk, Bezos, Zuckerberg, they'll all be up on the stage with Trump at his inauguration. So this very much does have the feel of a rising oligarchy. And I think for two important reasons. One, of course, is just the sheer scale and concentration of wealth in these people in one sector. I mean, billionaires have cozied up to president-elects for a long time. But what makes this quite unique is the fact it really has the feeling of these individuals sucking up and paying fealty to Trump rather than any ideological affinity with his platform or even personal fondness for the guy. I mean, there is this sense instead that they kind of have to do this, that they have been bullied into submission. And that's the perception, at least.
Let's talk now. I mean, there's always a sense of who do you credit for an achievement, a monumental achievement? And I'll take you back to the Iranian hostage crisis when Reagan came in at the back end of the Carter administration. Similarly, now we've reached some kind of agreement, some ceasefire agreement when it comes to Gaza. Will the credit go to the Biden administration or indeed the Trump administration that must oversee its implementation?
Well, I mean, as you rightly suggest, often, a presidency can be defined by simply what happens during those 4 years, whether the president himself was responsible or whether the president was to blame. So, one might argue that in terms of looking at Biden and looking at foreign policy generally, I mean, he didn't get involved in foreign entanglements. Indeed, he even pulled the US out of its biggest, Afghanistan. But then we also think, well, under his watch, Russia invaded Afghanistan. And then, of course, the October 7th attack happened, which sparked
Ukraine, you
the
mean? Sorry.
devastating.
Sorry, I've got to come in there. Under his watch, Russia
Uh,
invaded Ukraine, not
oh,
Afghanistan.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm so sorry. Yeah. That was in 1979. My
Yes.
apologies, not in 2022. Yeah. So, the October 7th attack, which sparked the devastating Gaza war. So he may well be stained by those events. And I don't think he's going to get any credit for bringing this, devastating war to a conclusion.
Of course, South Africa is watching, I would say, with some nerves as to what a Trump presidency might mean. We've seen legislators on both sides of the political divide pushing for tougher U.S. responses to South Africa's perceived threats to U.S. interests. How do you see that playing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what people are feeling is that, you know, I think what's important to remind people is that during the first Trump administration, there were a lot of threats and there was a lot of bluster, but the implementation was quite poor. And one would assume that this Trump administration has learned a lot of lessons from the first time around. So when they say that, South Africa may be punished for its stance on Israel, we should probably take them more seriously. Now, it seems like the South Africa has made some wise decisions in terms of who they put in charge in Washington. But I think that we must take seriously, much more seriously, the things that Trump is saying in terms of how he is expected to respond to certain countries around the world, including South Africa.
I want to play you a clip from the former DIRCO minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, when this threat of South Africa's position in AGOA was made. And this is how she explained the complexity involved and that perhaps it may not be as easy as headline writers might want to think. Have a listen.
On AGOA, well, there is also some sentiment that South Africa should be excluded from AGOA. And we think this would be a great pity. I don't know, in fact, how the trade would continue if you don't use the ports of South Africa, if you don't use the cargo system, if you don't use the logistics and the financial payment systems and the banking institutions. So I'm not quite sure what is meant by excluding South Africa. I also point out that of the 50 critical minerals that the United States uses in a range of manufactured products, including in the automotive sector, 15 of those minerals are from South Africa. And so I think this, for me, just indicates that the strategic relationship will continue and must continue.
She's got a point.
Well, she does in one sense, but remember, you can be very naive by being logical. This whole discussion about 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, every single economist in the world has warned that this is going to impact the United States very, very significantly in terms of increasing consumer spending and so forth. So just because you can come up with a logical argument for keeping South Africa in AGOA doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. I think anyone that makes any predictions with a high level of conviction at that moment is kidding themselves.
Let's talk about the kind of shape a second Trump presidency might take. You've mentioned the tariff, or at least the threats of tariffs against Canada and Mexico. But there have also been suggestions of Canada becoming a 51st state, the Panama Canal, Greenland. Already there's been some drama before he even takes office.
A lot of drama, and I mean, let's be honest. I mean, only Trump knows. I mean, from the outside, it's very hard to tell what might be real, what might just be bluster. It's very hard to tell what is really important for him to achieve, or what he might just be floating out there as a kind of trial balloon. You know, is there a method to the madness? Is there a coherent strategy in all of this? I think this is going to be a question that we're debating long after. But I think in broad terms, it's probably safe to assume that Trump really wants to embolden his image as a decisive leader with these comments. Someone who's willing to take quite bold actions for American interests, someone who doesn't play by the rules. So again, to my point earlier, I think in this Trump 2.0, we must think there's probably a lot more focus on implementation. There's probably a lot more focus on efficiency. I mean, that's what Elon Musk's appointment is all about. So whilst these things might sound kind of like crazy time, I think, you know, on January 21st, I think we're going to find out, you know, we're going to be able to separate rhetoric and reality quite quickly.
One of the big issues in America, of course, at the moment is what happens next to the social media platform TikTok. Donald Trump seems to be indicating, if you will, a change of heart, because he believes that a huge part of his success is the fact that he was able to reach young voters through that platform. Will it stay? Will it go?
So I think it's an open question, but I think Trump's own instincts would probably reverse the momentum that Biden has established in terms of banning TikTok. But remember, he's appointed as the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's one of the most anti-China hawks out there. And so one would imagine that that he would probably be pushing for Biden's ban of TikTok to be sustained. So I think it's an open question. I mean, again, I don't have a high level of conviction what's going to happen either way.
From Gaza to Greenland, I think the disruptive force of Donald Trump as U.S. president is going to be felt around the world. Appreciate your time as always. Dr. Terence McNamee, who is a writer, consultant, and non-resident global fellow at the Wilson Center.
Current events. Developing stories.
Tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.